It's my great pleasure to welcome Jean-Jacques Dethier. Dr. Jean-Jacques Dethier was with the World Bank for many, many years, but he is equally long a friend of CEF, the Center for Development Research. He joined as a senior fellow. He spent a year here in which he produced a very important book on governance and development. It's in the library. If you haven't read it, look it up. Jean-Jacques has also worked with the International Labour Organization and other international organizations. Yes, covers broad grounds of development economics related to resources, fiscal, social security work, social security related research. And as years went by, Jean-Jacques also became a historian of development economics. Jean-Jacques Dethier has his doctoral degree from Berkeley. And I think he stayed in touch a lot with Berkeley over the years, as you did with our institute. Today, Jean-Jacques Dethier will talk about a brief history of development, development thinking and foreign assistance to development. Jean-Jacques, you are asked to speak no more than about 40 minutes. And then we want to engage you in debate. There are other development historians and those who live development here in the room. And I know you want to have debate. Please, take the floor. Welcome to Jean-Jacques Dethier.
Thank you very much. And thank you for coming to this talk on such a hot day. This clicker. Yeah. Thank you. What I want to do is very briefly, talk about the post-war history of developing country, not from an economic perspective, but from what is known as a global history perspective. What is global history? For those of you who don't know. Actually in the last 20, 30 years, a number of historians have started this to write along these lines. I mean, essentially, global history is the history of the interconnection between countries which have increased with the process of globalization. Probably the best book, and I certainly engage you all to read it, is this fabulous piece by Bailey, a British historian, but there are many of them, one of which is actually a professor of history in Heidelberg called Dietmar Rotermund. A lot of people have written along those lines. What is the motivation for this piece? To tell you the truth, is my dissatisfaction with the narrow economic history of developing countries. I think a lot of issues that we deal with, that people in CEF and other institutes deal with, to the extent they are looked at narrowly from an economic point of view, miss the point. I also think a lot of the historical accounts that circulate have too narrow a Western view. I've put there, one of the books of William Dalrymple, who's a wonderful British historian of India. In his book, The Last Mughal, he talks about, he laments the fact that there haven't been Indian perspectives on history. Usually British historians say, well, we couldn't find archives, we could... In fact, he was able to find wonderful archives, in Persian, in Urdu, and in other languages, and came up with this book. So, same with global history. If you work hard at it, you can come up with a much better picture of the interconnections of developing countries with their former colonizers. I should also say that the word development, the word developing country, least developed countries, and so forth, which are often used by us, have become increasingly meaningless. Why put China and Mali in the same category? I mean, it makes really not much sense. As a matter of fact, the UN system has never insisted on that. Even in the WTO, for example, members have to announce whether they categorize themselves as developed or developing, because the status of developing country brings benefits. I mean, a longer period to go through the full implementation of the agreement. But other international institutions, the World Bank, for example, talk about low-income, middle-income, high-income countries. They don't make any other categorization. Development, to put it briefly, as you can easily imagine, is very linked with modernization. I mean, it's I won't go into that, especially since you probably know these issues very well. But the progress that a country goes through is linked to its modernization in terms of culture, in terms of urbanization and the like. And of course, development, and this is relevant for our talk, is very linked with nationalism. The increased awareness of national identity of a number of countries who then want to, go their own way and not the way of their colonizer. These are the points we will go through. And by the way, if you have a question, feel free to ask, or if you prefer, wait for the end of the talk and we can discuss all this. Of course, to a large extent, the post-war history of developing countries is linked with decolonization. Decolonization starts early, of course. Actually, the American Revolution is probably the most important decolonization period, and accelerates in the 20th century. Some events have been important, but probably the most critical period is the period after 1945, and that's the emergence of what was then called, we don't use that term very much anymore, the Third World. It's a typical Cold War name, meaning, not the US, Europe, and not the Soviet bloc, but an emerging third type of country. A lot of these countries, of the decolonization, took place in Africa around 1960. As you see there, in 1960, a lot of African countries were decolonized at a time in one fell swoop. I just want to point out that, a lot of developing country, and that's the beginning of my story, since I want to talk about economic policy and national policy in general, World War I was actually very beneficial for a number of developing countries, because since at that time a lot of manufactured products stopped arriving to the colonies, many of these countries started building up their industrial capacity, and this led to a growing demand for domestic product. Of course, during the Great Recession, the countries were very affected, and the terms of trade of those countries turned against them. But in general, actually, Rotermund has a very interesting book on this. developing countries throughout the Great Depression of 29 did actually better than developed countries. They came out of the slump faster, and there was an increase in exports largely because of the expansion of colonization. And also I should point out, during that whole period, the pre-World War II period, there was a huge increase in education in those developing countries. We now come to the roughly 1945-1971 period. Just remember, in 1945, virtually all the imperial or the colonial empires were still existing, with the exception of the Italian one, which didn't last very long. Very quickly thereafter, a few years after, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Belgian Congo, and so forth, started going in, falling in pieces, and the decolonization period and the independence of a very large number of countries begins. At the time, policymakers and their friends actually in developed countries thought that independence meant essentially industrialization. Okay, the meaning of development at the time was industrialization and education. I mean, of course, everybody was understood that you needed to educate the population, have a very strong cadre of people in your country. This has given rise to what is known, and you know that from your economics textbook, to import substituting industrialization. The belief was that free trade, export orientation was dangerous, risky for those countries, and of course there were reasons for that. I mean, the terms of trade had turned against them in the previous interwar period. The terms of trade for tropical product actually had collapsed to a large extent. There was also a lot of sympathy for the Soviet Union, who was coming out victorious from the war and who looked to be doing very well. Most countries embarked, Latin America, who was the main proponent, but a lot of newly independent African country, Asian country, embarked on import substituting industrialization. Unfortunately, this was in a context, one step too fast. This was in the context of the Bretton Woods system, which, as you all know, was an agreement on the architecture of the international architecture. And basically the Bretton Woods system has two tenets. The first one is that you should stabilize economies with activist fiscal and monetary policy. And the second one is that they had chosen fixed exchange rate essentially to promote trade. This actually was a huge problem, as a fantastic book, I think, by whose name escapes me, but just Google Upsfeld and Taylor, history of macroeconomic or something like that. As they will tell you, fixed exchange rate, international capital mobility, and independent monetary policy is mutually incompatible. You can have two of these points, but not all three at the same time. You can, if you have fixed exchange rate and international capital mobility, that pins down interest rates and therefore prevents you from carrying out an independent monetary policy. So that Bretton Woods, having chosen monetary independence and fixed exchange rate, this means that countries had to impose capital control, and through that entire period, from 45, say, until 73, this was what countries went through. As a result, of course, international capital markets were extremely segmented. Trade deficit became a huge problem for a lot of these countries because, this was, they were running permanent trade deficit, running down their reserves. And this is exactly the opposite of what you want, because you want to accumulate reserves if you want to industrialize, right? So those countries, even though between, say, 45 and early 60s, even though they were doing quite well, and in some countries extremely well, you could see problems emerging on the horizon. Let me say a few words about aid. Aid came out of nowhere. Not quite nowhere, because before World War II, you had a lot of assistance from rich countries to poor countries, but it was mainly private. There's a fantastic book actually by Miss McCleary, who teaches at Harvard, on aid before World War II. The sums are actually very considerable, but they were all, Caritas, Save the Children, these types, often actually linked to religious activities. Immediately in 1945, the UN system is built up after the San Francisco Conference in 45. Not only the UN in its General Assembly, but all the agencies of the system are built up, and that's in fact the beginning of aid. For example, a number of reasonably well-known development economists, Paul Rosenstein-Rodan, Hirschman, and others, worked in those UN agencies. UN agencies which has the support of the United States in 1945, actually very much so, but very quickly thereafter were marginalized because of the Cold War. Basically, the Cold War created difficult, different conditions. The U.S., as you well know, came out with its Marshall Plan in 47, I believe. And for example, the World Bank, which was created to assist in the reconstruction of Europe, was totally marginalized by the Marshall Plan, and then redirected its effort towards the newly independent developing countries. Just a few words on, at that moment, a bit later, in the mid-50s, remember there is also a growing number of countries, India in particular, Nasser's Egypt, Suharto's Indonesia, and who feel ill at ease in one bloc or the other, and start the non-aligned movement, which had some success, but then sort of petered out in the. Now, at the time, this is when aid actually begins, very soon in 1945, but at that period, it is actually very strongly politically motivated. Aid goes to your friends or to buy off your friends. What is the ideology? There's a chair here for the gentleman. What is the general thinking about, what do people think about development? In the United States, it's actually what became known as Modernization Theory, and was very, very influential in sociology in particular, is basically the dominant thinking at the time. You've all heard about the takeoff theory. Basically people take advanced countries as the model. All the other countries are backward and have to go through a number of phases, including what Rostov called the takeoff, and off you go towards bigger and better things. That was the general ideology, and I have to say, even some sociologists, which we would now call right-wing, like Samuel Huntington, were very much against the sort of very mechanistic approach that people like Talcott Parsons and others took. On the contrary, they thought that modernization meant increasing complexity, and that increasingly complex politically and economically societies then have their own dynamics. The counterpart to modernization theory in those first 20 years was, to a certain extent, not explicitly, but was dependency theory, a theory which started actually in the interwar period with people like Raoul Prebisch, Hans Singer, who, aware of the terms of trade that were against developing countries, essentially advocated import substitution industrialization. Sociologists afterward, like Fernando Enrique Cardoso, added the political framework to that, but basically showing that there were, you had a metropolis that was directing the trade and turning the terms of trade against the periphery, which was endlessly dependent on them. Now, one point briefly about how could you help poor countries? What is the mechanism? At the time, places like the World Bank responded, let's do projects. And now, pretty much everybody thinks, has in mind projects. But it's not obvious that you should transfer money in the form of projects. In fact, Rosenstein-Rodin, in 1942 and in a few years later, was very much against projects. He wanted a more comprehensive approach to development, not narrowly focused on one, say, building one bridge or one factory. He wanted a more comprehensive approach, which essentially became one model 40 years later, with structural adjustment. This is just an aside. As I said before this parenthesis on aid, things went well for most developing countries, but problems started to build up until they came to a crisis in the late 60s. Why the problems? One, because of the worsening trade balance, the almost endemic balance of payment problem resulting largely from the strategy they had adopted. Second, food supply. You may not remember this because most of you are very young, but until, say, the early 60s, the specter of famine and food problems, in particular in Asia, was dominant. There was population growth, food was in limited supply, and this was actually one major concern for a lot of countries, from Korea to Egypt to many other countries. Why? To a large extent because of the population explosion. The progress in those countries, the economic progress, had led to a huge population explosion. You are in those countries, you were in the so-called demographic transition, where mortality declines very sharply, but natality continues to rise. The result, I don't know if you can read those numbers, but is very visible there, where the poorest countries in 50 years have more than quadrupled their population. So because of all these problems, you start having increasing economic difficulty. a lot of rich countries, so that means essentially the United States and the former colonizing country, Britain, France, Belgium, and the like, who until then had told their friends in Africa and Asia, oh, you industrialize and, all of a sudden development will happen, realize increasingly that social problems were rising. Probably, to be fair, the first to make a strong point about that were the intellectuals around the Kennedy administration in the United States. People who had been, in universities like Harvard and then became advisors to Kennedy. In 1960, they started, they realized that aid had to be institutionalized. The Inter-American Development Bank was created. IDA, which is the grant-giving agency of the World Bank, was created in 1960. I mean, you have a list there. In less than 2 years, all major OECD countries start building the institutions for aid giving. Then comes, this is a history that you know well, then come the 60s and two major events. The first one is the oil price increases, actually, one in 73, one in 78, and price increase by developing countries, by producers of a number of primary commodities. The other is the fact that the United States stopped the gold standard, in 73, but there was a period in between 71 and 73 of increasing problems. So what does that mean? That the rich countries, the industrialized countries, all adopt floating exchange rates. At the time, so that means that the IMF, by the way, the International Monetary Fund, has no more a job with rich countries, and it turns its focus on the increasing liquidity problems of developing countries who had almost endemic reserve problems and problems of the trade deficit and balance of payment deficit. The situation created very serious social problems. In fact, if you recall, throughout Latin America in the 60s, in Asia, and in many countries, you had political instability leading to military coup, to very disruptive events. So both from an economic and a political problem, it was a really difficult period. This leads to adjustment lending. So a lot of, basically financial institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, making available to developing countries, large transfers of resources to allow them to maintain their standard of living. At the time, actually, it was how should I say? It was a very salutary step, because otherwise the economies of these countries would have collapsed. I mean, the standard of living of these countries. However, in the context, in the context of the 70s, basically you end up having, because of the conditions that these countries had to, the economic reforms that they had to go through, it led to stability, but on the other hand, very little to growth, and it also generated in the Cold War context and the context of clientelism, a lot of corruption and poor governance in these countries. In terms of development thinking, something important that happened is that throughout the 70s, import substitution industrialization was increasingly questioned by a lot of economists and thinkers, both in developing and in developed countries. The 80s, when the adjustment lending became frequent, were, as you know, the period of the sort of neoliberal counter-revolution, the Thatcher and Reagan years, where the state interventionism was very questioned, and a number of policies of sort of free market policies were imposed through the conditionality of the adjustment loans on these countries. The results were mixed. I mean, I say mixed because on the one hand you had that stabilization, but at the same time you also had an increasing number of social problems resulting largely from the fact that at no time actually were social problems, problem of poverty, of income distribution factored into those packages, those policy packages. This led actually increasingly, I mean, at first they were a very small minority and then they became more and more vocal. This led a number of economists, Amartya Sen, but also Mahbubul Haq, Francis Stewart, many others, to sort of advocate a new approach, an emphasis on human development. And, for example, you know that quite well, the creation of the Human Development Index, which was then taken over by the UNDP. An index of a few dimensions of human development, which allows you to look at the impact of policies on those countries. Aid, at the same time, there's also a rethinking of aid at the same time. People realize that clientelism has not had the desired results, that a lot of the aid money that was given by Germany, US, France, and the like to developing countries just went down the drain or in the Swiss bank account of dictators. And a serious rethinking of aid begins in the late, in the mid-90s, I would say. In 1998, for example, the World Bank, a group of World Bank economists, publishes a very influential book called Assessing Aid, which talks about the fungibility of aid, and the need for much more selectivity. Essentially saying, give aid to deserving countries, those that have policies that are conducive to growth. I mean, so we go in the late 40s from a so-called needs-based aid system to a much more selective system, to the point where now, I think virtually all donors use a formula trying to, capture how performing the policies of the receiving government are. So, of course, each country or each institution has its own formula, but a lot of them use something that the World Bank had been using for a while called CPIA. Now, IDA, the International Development Association, which is certainly the largest donor in terms of volume, and which is an agency that gets replenished by rich donor every 4 years, in 1998 started using, a selectivity mechanism, because they realized that the absorptive capacity of a number of countries was very affected by its governance. So in other words, if your governance institutions are very poor, aid will have no impact. Therefore, they used an index, the CPIA, where governance indicators have a lot of weight, 68% actually, it's quite high. Other indicators like macroeconomic stability, structural policy, social policy have 25%, and then you have some other indicators, for example, on your portfolio, and a few corrective mechanism, for example, to give more funding to post-conflict countries or countries in fragile countries, which, if you use the formula, would not receive much. But now this is a major change, a change that happened roughly at the turn of the century, going from a system of essentially of clientelism, where you give money to your friend, the French give money to Western African Francophone countries, the U.S. to the Philippines, Belgium to Mobutu, and so that's a buddy system of aid, to a system of aid which is much more transparent and driven by the institutional strength of the country. For example, the United States Millennium Challenge account, a fairly new institution, is just formula driven. They use the formula, and whichever country has the highest scoring gets the money. That's how it works. Has aid had an impact? Well, it's very difficult to do. I mean, if you look at development, the broad view of development, to the extent we have the data and we have the methodology to assess that, which, as you can imagine, is very difficult to have a cause and effect link between aid and the impact. What can we say? Well, between 45 and, say, the late 70s, there was progress, definitely, but it was very slow, in particular concerning income. Probably the most progress happened in terms of health, very often because of the modernization process, where mortality declined, certainly not enough, but there were improvements, but there were also very serious issues. After 1980, and there we have much more data, survey data from a very large number of countries. After 1980, what we can say is that there was huge progress, in particular in poverty decline, reduction of poverty, but also a huge unevenness in the progress across countries. Poverty reduction, the data tell us, and here we are on fairly strong ground. In 1980 was about, poverty measured as, $1 a day, was about 52% of the world population was poor. In 2011, the last data we have, it's 17%. That's a huge progress, right? A lot of usually very large emerging countries, mainly China, India, but a few others as well, have gone through massive progress, have sort of a middle class which has grown tremendously and created a lot of progress. Convergence, the term that economists use to talk about how quickly rich countries and poor countries reach the asymptote. Convergence is not taking place. It's On the contrary, as one economist said, it's divergence big time. It's happening, convergence is happening. I mean, look at China, but not for the majority of country. In fact, there are huge income gaps between high-income countries, middle and low-income countries. Poverty and hunger has declined, but in some specific area, it is still, very much present and an endemic problem. Probably the most successful country, without any doubt, is China, because it has been the one successful country which, in a matter of one generation, has taken millions and millions of people out of poverty. In other, I don't have time to go through the details. In fact, in the paper that I prepared, that you're welcome to read, and in fact, I would greatly appreciate your critical comments. There is much more detail, but you get the general picture. It's fair to say that in the last few years, one critical issue has been the growth of inequality of income. Not only inequality of income within the same country, which has grown enormously in the United States, for example, but inequality between countries. Now, it's not easy to measure inequality. I mean, what is it that we're talking about? On this graph, which was produced by my friend Branko Milanovic, you see two measures of inequality. The first one at the bottom is what he calls inter-country inequality. So you take the average income in each country, unweighted by population or anything, and that gives you, inter-country distribution. It's a bit strange because, Monaco and China have the same weight. It's kind of a strange picture, but if you choose average income weighted by population, you get a much nicer measure. You see, that's called international inequality, and you have two measures including China and India, and not including China and India. It gives you a good sense of how things have developed. Of course, the best measure, there are some papers talking about that, but as you can imagine, it's much more difficult, would be to look at global income distribution. So take all the income of all the people in the world, regardless of their country of residence, and look at how it's distributed. But we don't have that here, but there are some papers. So much for the results of what development and to a certain extent aid has produced. Aid at the present time, even though it has become more selective, has also has had a declining importance as a source of finance. As a matter of fact, middle-income countries, countries like Malaysia or many Latin American countries, you can ask yourself, why would you want to give aid to those countries? They have easy access to international capital markets. They can borrow on capital markets. A lot of foreign direct investment flows to these countries. Some of them has very high remittances, Philippines, Egypt, and the like. And because of the globalization of financial flows, they shouldn't have any problem, provided, of course, their public finance institutions are in good shape. Low-income countries are in a very different basket. More than 100 countries simply do not borrow on international markets. They don't have that ability. It's too expensive. So they have to rely on donors. This includes a lot of poor countries, they don't attract foreign direct investment. It's very difficult for them to compete with Russia, China, of course, which are more attractive propositions. So for those countries, aid is still very important. If you look at the picture of, you ask yourself, how can a country find the financing for its development, for investment? Well, generally most countries do that on either through FDI or through other forms of investment on international markets. That and trade are the two engines of the development. And in fact, you see that ODA, official development assistance, which is the word for aid, has declined sharply. It's now much less than 20% of all the resources that flow into developing countries. Private capital flows continue to grow and probably will continue to grow in the future. Aid in the 21st century, so now, is of course very different from what it was in 1960. I told you about the institutionalization of aid. At the time, there were 12 countries, 61, 62, and that was it. There were a few NGOs. Now you have more than 35 donors in the OECD, plus some 230 international organizations, large ones, smaller ones, plus thousands of NGOs, some of them actually very active and effective. Basically, you have the DAC countries, okay, the traditional donors. You have also very active new donors, the main ones, of course, being China, but there are many others. You have a lot of global funds, vertical funds, like the Global Fund for TB, malaria, and HIV, Gavi, the vaccination fund, and so forth. You have private foundations, which play a huge role, like the Gates Foundation, in some issues like health or the environment. And you have important international NGOs like Oxfam and the like. So it's a complex and often very complicated picture. What characterizes, of course, aid is probably most typically is probably the entrance of China, which has become, not quite, but is quickly becoming as important a player as other rich countries. But the world has changed tremendously. I mean, think of this. 2 years ago, Angola was lending Portugal to pay its debt. I mean, that really tells you something. The world has changed. Angola was decolonized in 1975. Okay, so not only has the world changed, but things have accelerated also. And now you have basically two types of aid model. Aid being one component of a much broader foreign policy approach of rich country. You have the typical OECD countries, which have changed the way they do things. They're much more transparent. According to them, they harmonize their policies. According to me, they don't, but they are selective. I mean, so things have changed a lot, and they are now much more effective in the way they deliver aid. But then next to that, you have countries like China, India, Brazil, and a few others who have a very different approach, which they call horizontal partnership, and which, if you listen to African government, for example, are very effective. I mean, I think a lot of African government welcome with open arms Chinese aid on a number of issues. The way they do it, I mean, I think essentially they call that mutual benefit. I mean, they say, you know, let's make deals which are mutually beneficial to our two nations. And to a large extent, that's why I mentioned it earlier, this is a continuation of the non-aligned movement, the Bandung principle, which was dormant for a long time, but which has been reawakened. So this is the South-South cooperation that the non-aligned movement was hoping for. What is the thinking now, you know, after the state industrialization, after the 80s? I think we're now beyond the dogmas of state control, of the free market. There's a much more sophisticated view of the complementarity between markets and state, how they have to work. Probably the most important point, in fact, it became increasingly clear to me as I was writing this paper, is the importance of trade policy. You know, I think the trade policy, people don't realize how essential that is. The fact that the commercial policy orientation of a lot of countries has changed very much, say, since 1980. The fact that trade barriers have declined substantially, the fact that there are much more trade agreements between countries has changed things dramatically. Finally, I think it's fair to say that now, virtually in all aid institutions, multilateral organizations, NGOs, and the like, governance and institution is at the forefront of the preoccupation. It's not immediately clear to me what consequences that's supposed to have, but I think people are aware of the importance of that. What does that mean? I'm now concluding. I mean, first of all, think of this. Aid represents, even now, where the largest sums ever have been given out, about 133 billion. Aid still represents a tiny part of the funds needed for the development of those countries. The funds come from FDI, come from other ventures. The development happens because of technology transfers, because of knowledge acquisition, for you sitting here, learning, going back to your country. I mean, I think that is truly what development is made of, not the 133 billion given to all those. And also, aid has a very bad rap. I mean, it's often corrupt, it's often ineffective, and the joke is, aid is financial assistance by poor people in rich countries for rich people in poor countries. I mean, that's very often what happens, siphoning off, money from Germany or the U.S. to the rich and their bank accounts in poor countries. Now, to conclude, what can we conclude? What does this global history teach us? I mean, number one, you're not discovering anything. I mean, we're now living in a very different world, a multipolar world, not a hegemonic world dominated by the U.S. If you think about a number of development problems, narrow economic answers are not good enough, I think. Things are much more complex. You have to take into account social implication. You have to take into account the fact that people change, people get empowered as they get more educated, as the mentalities change. I mean, that's development, actually. Nationalism is an important phenomenon. Very often you wonder, why is something happening? A sense of national identity is often the beginning of an answer, I mean, because, we want to be an independent country and that's how we want to do things. And then finally, I mean, I think for me, there's no doubt about that. Trade, in a broad sense, trade, finance, and the like, is much more important than aid. And the key issue, which often gets lost in economic discussions now, is building state capacity. That's what it's about, building not only a civil society, but also the state and having capable institutions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jean-Jacques, for this tour de force through history of development and change. I'm pleased to note that CEF, the Center for Development Research, is not called Center for Development Aid Research. That's not what we are. We are not on the 3%, but mainly we are on the 100%. What happens there in terms of change? The departments of CEF have the word change in there, technological change, cultural change, and so on. I'm sure you have questions to Jean-Jacques as he wants to shape his thoughts further in that paper, which he kept in obscurity so far, but we at some point can share it.
Yeah.
He might even write a book, he threatened today, on these issues, so he may come back and call for your inputs. Let's go by seniority. Ambassador Schlackenberg.
I often wonder, thank you very much, it's very interesting and inspiring. I very often wonder, is there an analysis of success, of the real reasons of the success of successful countries? Of course, the most important, the most interesting is China. And I wonder whether the Chinese, it is what we call a kind of Protestant ethics. Much work, little enjoyment. They refuse it, they say no, but I think that something like that is behind it, and this would show that ethical problems, the kind of work and the kind of your relationship towards work is a very important thing, and this is also, of course, tied to tribalism.
That's a very good point. China is funny because economists tell you what is the recipe for success. You have to have strong property rights, well-defined markets. You go through the list. What has China done? Exactly the opposite. So I think it puts the onus on economists to rethink what. They have no strong property rights, they have no transparency, they have no democracy, yet they've been very successful, I think. I think there are a lot of actually even good analysis of development success. What we don't have, I think, is a good analysis of aid effectiveness. Because it's very difficult to if you look at some success, to relate that to the aid, because it's not, there are many other factors that intervene. So that I think, you have a lot of single, papers dealing with single projects, but not, yeah.
Mm-hmm. There were other questions here in the corner. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you also for the nice overview. As you said at the end, you think that trade, in a very broad sense, is the most important factor in development, or let's call it development, of developing countries, and has been. I think you've shown also that from the 80s on, which was the urbanization period, we get an explosion of the effects. And we get an explosion of side effects in terms of inequality and inequality of poverty. So, my question would be, how would you think trade has to develop in order to counter that, or for development to be more even? Or can we do that through trade as well?
Well, yeah, I think by the way, the key now in terms of trade liberalization is trade in services. I think to a large extent that when it comes to trade in goods, there have been major achievements through the WTO and the like. Tariffs for some countries, developing countries, are still very high, could come down, but the real issue is trade in services now. And what we all wish would happen is exactly the opposite of what's happening. You have now a sort of a balkanization of trade, a lot of single agreements. It's very difficult to, I think, I don't want to say that trade liberalization is the answer, because it's not. Actually, for vulnerable countries, it can be very devastating. Yeah, but in my mind, there's no doubt we have now almost a century of experience with import substitution, and that the way to generate savings, which allows development, is through export orientation and industrialization in that way. And in fact, that's exactly what the Chinese are doing. My previous boss at the World Bank was a Chinese president who has written a lot about export-oriented industrialization, and I think he's right. I think it's, of course, a country like China, with the industrial base it has, just cannot compete even with countries very large like Bangladesh and the like. But I think with enough safeguards, trade liberalization is the answer, and not certainly small agreements between one country and between several countries, which you see increasing.
Well, let me look into this corner. Is there any questions here? Jean-Jacques, I think you underemphasized two big events. One is falling wall and change of former Soviet Union, and 10 years before, liberalization of the Chinese farmer. And I think both of these stories triggered what you emphasized so much, institutions and governance issues. Am I right or am I right?
You're absolutely right. I think the answer to that is because you told me I should speak for 40 minutes.
No, I think it will be a chapter. Yeah.
No, I think you're right. I mean, actually, in fact, it's in the paper.
Okay.
I think that change in thinking happened at the same time as the so-called transition, right? Of first China, then East European and Russia, and certainly in terms of reorienting capital towards a lot of Eastern European countries, and in terms of thinking, it happened at the same time. Yes.
Let me ask you another one. You know so well the history of development thought from the books behind you and those which you mentioned. What influence did big development thinkers have? You mentioned Arthur Lewis. I think it's just his 100th birthday last week or so. So was their thinking endogenous, or did they drive development? I think it's a fundamental question for a little think tank like us.
Yeah.
are things just happening, or, I mean, your reflections on that, please.
That's a very good question.
Was Amartya Sen and Arthur Lewis endogenous, or did they actually change things?
I think Amartya Sen was, definitely. You know, I think you have to think more in terms of paradigm. One paradigm, by the way, was Lewis's,
model,
unlimited supply of labor.
Yeah.
I mean, that was, which is essentially the paradigm of industrialization. Right? I mean, I think also a lot of development economies have had no impact whatsoever. But I think there have been some key ideas. Human development, for example, is certainly one key idea that has, and a very good one, because it undercut, in a way, the, sort of the go-go year, the Thatcher-Reagan free market go-go years. People say, hello, excuse me, social consequences. That was very good. But I also think, for example, people like Anne Kruger and have also had, Ian Little and those people who've asked us to rethink import, substituting industrialization, have been very important. Whether we like them or not, they helped us rethink. So yeah, I think there are some important markers.
Yeah, if I reflect on that answer, you mentioned Cardoso, the thinker and later head of state of Brazil, and his conversations with Albert Hirschman, who I think was a great development thinker, sociologist, economist, probably shaped the whole change in Latin America a lot more than Lula and others who came then 10 years later or 20 years later. So there was a lot of thinking, but we spare you under this heat the question, what influence did the World Bank have on thinking? But there was a last question over here and there. Please, go ahead. Was there a hand up? Yeah, go ahead.
No, but I think the question you just asked about who Amartya Sen and all this, it's interesting that behind the underlying question is, can we have an influence on things, or is the system just going around, evolving by itself? My question goes back to one of your conclusions, which was we are much more into a multipolar world, not only driven by the United States. There are some indicators that not agree completely with that. For example, I think the United States are spending 51% of the global military budget. That's a lot. And that's not multipolar. And there's others, things like that. So, of course, the world has become more complex, but yeah, I want to question again this multipolar idea, because I
think it is multipolar, because the 51% is not going to stay there for long. I think China is catching up very quickly. Others are, so things are changing, and essentially the U.S. is spending a lot on defense because Europe does not have to. That may change too. But I think, yeah, you have a point. I mean, we still live in a world that is largely with strong U.S. hegemony, but it's not. I mean, U.S. is not the largest country from an economic point of view anymore. China is, and for the next 15, 20 years, the largest country in the world will be a middle-income country, which also is a bit, false. So you will have to live with all these, these features which shows you that, the world changes as we speak. Of course, nobody can say what's going to happen, but you know, for me, what's important is what's going to happen with the developing countries. Some have changed enormously, right? I mean, think about it. You know, 20 years ago, who would have thought that China, Brazil, India would be where they are now? But at the same time, other countries will, you know, how successful will they be? How much suffering will there be in many of these poor African countries? It's very difficult to, and how can we change that? I mean, that's the key issue.
Colleagues, I suggest that we move into the much colder foyer room. You engage Dr. Dethier in conversations, stand and sit there. I think that will be more comfortable for you and him. I would like to thank you very much, Jean-Jacques, for coming with your thoughts, for even bringing your dear wife, Shilpa Patel, with you, a development practitioner from India. And I thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much.